You ever wonder why the maker industry of the early 2000s died off, or why there's not as much reporting on 3D printer technology as there used to be, or whether you should get into 3D printed guns or hot air balloons? Today's guest has all those answers. Welcome back to T-Rex Talk. This episode is going to be a guest interview with Hoffman Tactical. And first, I want to introduce you as a local Tennessean, practically a neighbor. But you're also involved in the firearm industry in kind of an interesting way. So why don't you explain that in just a little bit of detail, however deep you want to go?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on, Isaac. I am actually in Tennessee here, so a bit further east, more real Tennessee, of course, than Central Tennessee. It's a bit of a spectrum there.
You have the mountains, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure there. But yeah, so I am involved in a little bit of an odd way in the firearms industry, not from my perspective, but kind of from a more conventional perspective. So I design 3D printed guns, and that's probably what I'm best well known for. And AR lowers, basically kind of like 80%, which has been around for a while. Most people kind of know what that means. So it's like make your own gun in home, except rather than buying a 80% receiver and machining it, you're printing it on a 3D printer kind of just from scratch, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the basic concept behind what we do.
Now, according to people on the internet who are, of course, experts, what you're doing is completely 100% illegal and wrong and bad and evil and wicked and terrible. Are any of those things actually true?
Also impossible. They blow up and they only last a few rounds. The 3D printed guns. That's also a fact.
Yeah.
A fact from Reddit as well that I read. It depends on the area that you're in. So as far as functionality goes, at this point, it depends on what you want to print. There's a lot of 3D printed designs available nowadays. I specialize in the AR platform because it's really common, very useful, and at this point, branching out is definitely a possibility, but AR stuff is what I've stuck to. So the lowers, which is kind of the main thing as far as practical firearm goes, printing your own lower receiver, because that's the regulated part under federal law. Very structural integrity is excellent, pretty much equivalent to any other lower. I mean, obviously it's plastic, so doesn't have quite the heat resistance and such, but very functional. And
you reinforce the areas that
oh yes, for sure,
aluminum is stronger than plastic.
Oh,
but
yes,
you can always reinforce areas with plastic.
Yeah, so the designs are completely departed from what a standard mill spec, if I may, lower looks like, and that's been done for structural reasons. I think I actually use the most well-known part of my lowers is I use a hose clamp, actually. If you've seen that, I use I have the black oxide, but really any hose clamp will work. And that's the buffer band. That's part of the reinforcement system. And there's some other things I do as well. But yeah, for sure, we're not just taking a standard receiver design and printing it, because those don't last at all. So yeah, there's a lot of design work done to make it appropriate for 3D printing. So basically designed for manufacture. You can't take a part designed to make from forged aluminum and expect to make it from plastic on an FDM 3D printer. So the design has been completely revamped for printing. You mentioned the legality of it, and obviously I'm not super into the legal side of things. I do more of the technical design work to make it work. But legally, under federal law, making your own firearm at home is completely legal and no paperwork required.
Always has been. Yeah.
Always has been. Yes, exactly. So it's actually kind of a long American tradition. So under state law, there are a few bad states, a number of them actually, that we have that regulate making your own firearm in various different ways. California comes to mind, New York comes to mind, and I believe Illinois, and there are probably some others as well, who regulate it in a more or less severe fashion. So under state law, it depends where you are.
Yeah. Now, something that I am interested to see if it happens, but because that federal law allows for it. And I think that there is a great post-Bruin Second Amendment foundation for challenging some of these bad states. Now, the problem is there is so much bad gun law in some of these bad states already that it's just kind of a get in line thing. I don't know when some of the gun rights organizations, when some of the plaintiffs, there's just so much other work to be done. I'm not sure when the do-it-yourself homemade firearms, aka ghost gun bills will get attacked because they can be, I think, really easily challenged, but there's only so many gun rights organizations. There's only so many plaintiffs. There's only so many lawyers and only so many hours in a day. It'll probably be a while before we can get to all of those in all of the states. And people keep making new bad gun laws to be fought. So it is kind of a never ending conveyor belt.
Correct. Yes. Right now, I don't see that happen in the near term in some of the more extreme states. Maybe in some cases it would be done, but in like California, New York, there's a lot of problem bills, as you mentioned, to deal with. So it's it's gonna be a while, I think.
So here's a question for you. Since there's a bunch of states that don't like do-it-yourself firearms, and since the AR-15 platform is great, and there's a gazillion lowers out there, and they're actually really cheap to get the aluminum ones, why is this something that you are doing? What's the interest? How did you get into it?
That's a good question. So originally, I did not get into this to produce accessible firearms. It was a project I had started Hoffman Tactical. If you haven't noticed, like it's a not 3D printed gunny kind of name. Doing textiles. So I was actually sewing waterproof earmuff covers for a cheap garbage electronic hearing protection. It was a
We
bad
all
product.
probably have some of those. Yeah.
Yeah, didn't go anywhere. I think I sold like 6 of them. So there's some guy in Maryland who has some fabric waterproof hearing protection covers. I've never seen any, so hopefully they're gone forever. But so I started out doing that, and I got into 3D printing because I had because of a couple things. But one of the main ones, I had a friend who worked at a company who 3D printed magazine followers for competition Glock magazines, which they manufactured. And that just kind of got me thinking about 3D printing because I'd always considered it because it's been around for a long time at this point, a decade, relatively popular. This is back in like 2019. I started taking it more seriously, got a printer, and printing a lower was just a cool project I thought I would try because I had discussed it with my friend who did 3D printing. 3D printing it was like printing a lower would be an interesting project. So that's how I got started. There were no good options back then. There was a couple designs which were basically mil spec lowers, which had been scanned into 3D. So pretty well, there was a couple CAD models, but they were very similar to a mil spec lower in appearance. So pretty bad. And it just started from there. It grew in interest. So I slowly transitioned the business over to 3D printed guns because that's what people were interested in. So it's less my interest and more, for some reason, the public is very interested in 3D printed guns, at least the small segment of them that I deal with. So
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. This is something that I've talked about a lot and hope to study more in the future. But whenever you see a new manufacturing technology, weapons are right there. And it isn't just because nations with lots of tax dollars have always had military industrial complexes to spend money on stuff. Individuals are always tinkering and experimenting with stuff. And so oftentimes you do see like firearms are just such a fascinating tool. They require precision. They require a robust, like it is a very violent thing that happens inside of a firearm. People talk about gun violence all the time. I assume they're talking about like the explosion of the cartridge inside of the chamber, the expansion of the gases forcing the bullet down the barrel. There's a lot of stuff to try to manage inside a firearm, both design and manufacture. Anytime there's new technology that comes out, it is really fascinating to see arms manufacturers or hobbyists immediately jump on it. And a lot of really fascinating advances in technology and in manufacturing and in automation have come out of the firearm world. So it is not surprising to people who know history that 3D printer guys want to test the limits of materials, test the limits of printers, test the limits of design, test their ability to take a design that works in aluminum and build something that will work with a new material. Like it is just a fascinating laboratory environment, a fascinating thing to be involved in for testing and experimentation purposes.
for sure, it is an interesting area to work with, especially if you start getting out into more unique designs, which I haven't really done too much of myself, but some others have, and there's some cool projects going on. The other interesting thing with 3D printing, even compared, as you mentioned, to previous new technologies, right now is how incredibly cheap it is to get into
Yeah.
3D print your own guns. It's a lot cheaper, I would say, than most other manufacturing technologies, especially when they were new, because the 3D printing is a very low force process. There's
Hmm.
no need for heavy gantries. Intrinsically, it can be made very low cost, and it has. So you can get into 3D printing guns for a few $100s,
Yeah.
or less, even if you're really careful. So because of that, people, really anybody, can adopt it, regardless of their budget or their position in society, and that has allowed it to become quite a movement that has grown across a wide range of people.
Yeah. And I mean, it's safer too. If you are milling metal, the tools that are required to mill metal are kind of intrinsically dangerous. I have,
Scary.
router scars, and I know people who have done uh, what seemed to be incredibly safe investment casting of aluminum, and it turned out to be kind of explosive and go places. So there is an inherent safeness to 3D printing beyond other ways of doing stuff with plastic, other ways of doing stuff with metal. You can make some dangerous guns, but the actual manufacturing process itself is really safe. And I'm looking forwards to my kids getting into it and making toys and stuff like that, because it's a powerful, affordable technology, and they probably can't hurt themselves very badly. What's the hottest that you're running your nozzle temperatures for some of your prints?
About 290 Celsius. So that would
Mm-hmm.
be 270 to
That's
290. But
it's pretty warm.
you
Yeah.
don't, if you touch the nozzle, you'll have a bad day on your finger, but it's very local damage. You can also pinch yourself if
Yeah.
you're not careful, but it's all nothing life threatening compared to, if you see, I have a lathe sitting behind me, and I use it relatively sparingly, and it can be frightening under the right circumstances. So it's
Oh, for sure.
a lot
Yeah.
more power going on, and a lot more that can go wrong spontaneously if you screw up. So
Yeah.
the printers are very very much child friendly compared to other technologies for sure.
Yeah, we have a extremely terrifying lathe at T-Rex. I've never used it by myself, and I never will. So yeah, there's a lot of fascinating stuff, but I think it is also just a fantastic gateway drug getting into manufacturing and automation and product design. There's so much stuff that you can experiment with and learn, and you can start so easily. I have some nieces and nephews that download stuff from Thingiverse and print it, and so they're learning process stuff, and they will be ready to start designing their own parts very soon. So it's yes, very accessible in cost, and in just the learning curve can be as shallow as you want it to be, basically.
Yes, and that's an interesting aspect you brought up there, which is the design side of things. So most people who get 3D printers, at least that I have seen, get a 3D printer and then they print items which they download, from the internet. So they're getting a pre-designed item and they're printing it, which is totally understandable. That's kind of one of the main attractions is you can take a digital item, which you get for free, make it into something physical at very low cost. That's what I do. I design items for other people to print. However,
Mm-hmm.
3D printing becomes a lot more useful if you can design what you want. So, if anyone is doing 3D printing, they can greatly increase their capabilities by getting into doing, CAD work. So, design of 3D digital files. So that's a big part of it. I see discussed a lot less, with 3D printing in general. Obviously, it exists because every single part that is 3D printed must have been designed, but a lot of people aren't really getting into it.
Yeah.
And one of the big reasons for that is the software is expensive. Um, I use SolidWorks, which is you either pay an
Mm-hmm.
exorbitant annual amount or you do what I do and you buy a seat, which is also exorbitantly expensive. I did that because I'm very familiar with the software. It's what I learned on, so it's easy. I like some of the I like the tools and such. Um, probably the more popular option nowadays would be Fusion 360. However, it's quite a bit less capable. That's kind of controversial. Some people will disagree,
Yeah,
but the big
it is one of the great battles
yeah,
in this space: SolidWorks versus Fusion 360. We
but
use Fusion 360 at T-Rex, but some of our engineers are diehard SolidWorks fans, and so yes.
so yeah. Um, I would call myself a fan because there's a lot of things I hate about SolidWorks. The default systems as well, the way they market it, I don't like a lot of that. But one of my issues with Fusion 360 is it's a subscription service, which I do not like at all. So that's why that's
For
one of the
sure.
reasons I like
Yeah.
SolidWorks is it's not a subscription. That's a different conversation, really. The whole software moving over to everything really moving over to subscription services, which I don't like. Um, but getting into design work, I think having better open source design tools would be very, very useful. Currently, we really just have FreeCAD, which I have played with a tiny bit and found it to be very difficult to use, hard to get around in. But
It's terrible. It's like somebody had 1990s AutoCAD and didn't know how to program, but tried to copy the interface from 1990s AutoCAD. Basically, that's what
yeah,
it feels like to
it,
me.
it was developed around that time period as well. I think early 2000s.
Yeah.
So it's not a very good option. So if any software uh, designers are interested in working on an important project, an open source CAD would be something I would be very interested in,
Yeah.
for sure.
And there's probably a lot of value in a simplified tool. Obviously, when you're building complex assemblies for automation machinery, you want some really high powered tools like SolidWorks has, like Fusion 360 has been getting recently. But if you're making relatively simple shapes for 3D printing, um, I imagine that that is the sort of thing that's well within a pretty small team of open source developers to create something that can create parametric solids, export meshes, slice them, print them. I think that that is, if you don't try to swallow uh, every part of the elephant at once, I bet you could make a tool that is extremely useful for 3D printed parts fairly simply.
Most likely, though, without being able to do more complex curves, I would be at a loss. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not.
Yeah, I do a lot of mesh stuff, and I can do ridiculously complicated organic stuff. But the precision and the accuracy that you get from parametric solids is what's
But
lacking at that
yeah,
point.
exactly. But I was gonna say that's cheating.
Oh yes,
So
of course it's cheating.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I've done CAD design streams in the past, so I go back and forth with different designers, and we discuss some of these things. And there are guys who could do some pretty amazing things with mesh modeling, but it's all pretty much a freehand process, and it requires a lot of skill to do well. I do not handle the process well, and only
It's
use it a couple
definitely
times.
cheating. Yeah, and it's also fake because you're building meshes. They can't exist in three-dimensional space except as infinitely thin planes, and so you fake thickness by creating additional. Yeah, it's completely fake. Also sculpting. I used to do a lot of sculpting in ZBrush.
Okay, yep.
Also fake. It's a whole nother layer of abstraction from the actual mechanical surfaces that if you're building firearms, vehicles, stuff like that, you need to do. Now, I think they're useful for mock-up. I will give you and the listeners to the podcast a heads up. The next TRX Labs episode, I'm going to design a gun, and it's going to be completely faked and kludged together in mesh modeling. It will not be anything that's close to being looked at by an engineer, but it's a very quick way to just like mock stuff up and measure. Oh yeah, this is the height from the eye to the
Ah,
cheekbone.
I see.
Sure.
A gun for you, like a model for use in a first person video game or something. That kind of
That is
type.
exactly what it's for. Well, YouTube
Oh,
has
okay.
some new rules now about firearms that go into effect tomorrow, which is probably when this podcast drops. So June 18th, YouTube has some new rules. They're specifically aimed at you, I
Hmm.
believe. They're specifically aimed at people who 3D print firearms or show instruction on how to build firearms. So what I am gonna do in the T-Rex Labs video is totally for video game purposes only. So yes, just get
Yeah,
ahead of
that's not a bad idea. Yeah, they're probably directly targeting me, and it could be an aggravation. The channel has been at risk for a while, but we'll see. I've been not doing too many videos on 3D printed guns recently, trying to like keep things coasting along. But I'll have to. We'll see. It'll be a challenge doing videos with the new rules for sure. Um,
Yeah. Well, here's a question for you. So, with that being said, you have other projects. You have non-firearm projects. You are at the very beginning of, or maybe in the very middle of, building a hot air balloon. Like, you have other fascinating projects that are YouTube safe potentially.
Yes. So I am building a hot air balloon. So any listeners who have tuned into my long podcast or live streams in the past will know that I have a fascination with airships. And that over a couple years slowly led down to hot air balloons because I can't afford to build an airship right now. So I decided to do a hot air balloon. It's the best entry both from a regulatory standpoint and from a cost and time standpoint. And it's actually I just finished it up yesterday. I'm waiting on this unstable weather conditions we're having right now to kind of calm down to do the first inflation. But yeah, so that would be YouTube friendly. I actually started some social media accounts which aren't really very popular yet, covering that process a little bit. I didn't do it as much as I'd like to, but I do have a plan to kind of move in that direction and sort of a backup, if that makes sense, because there's a
Nice,
distinct
yeah.
lack of information in media on hot air ballooning. It's mostly fancy
Yeah.
pictures, and that's where it ends. So yeah, that's the most interesting
Yes.
little project.
So okay. Now, this is a rabbit hole that we could go way down. You really need to talk to my brother Noah. Noah has a fascination with airships, which has cooled a little bit because he ran into probably some of the same hurdles that you did. The cost of building, registering, and flying an airship, even if you stick with hydrogen and you don't get a ton of helium. Or several tons of lifting power of helium. If you just stick with hydrogen, it's much more affordable, but there are some obstacles, shall we say?
It's the fabrics. You have to get custom made textiles, and
Coatings,
that's
yeah,
yeah, that's very expensive.
yeah.
Though I have found a company, ironically, at SHOT Show. I found like 5 different companies at SHOT
Okay,
Show for balloon fabric, webbing, thread. It was really cool. In fact, one of the companies I ended up buying my webbing from up in Pennsylvania, they supplied balloonists regularly. That's where a lot of the manufacturers get it from. So I had some interesting conversations at SHOT Show about
that's
balloons,
fascinating. Yeah.
including a
So I have a
Korean.
theory. I have a theory, and I could be wrong about this, but there is uh, there is a level of fear, not just about guns and the lunatics who make 3D printed firearms, but there is a fear of all kinds of risk and homemade airplanes. There all kinds of homemade stuff is kind of verboten. The DIY community, the makerspace community, it feels like it's really being kind of throttled down a little bit on YouTube and other places, largely because of risk related stuff, to the point where regular 3D printed channels have been shut down on YouTube just because they mention things that line up with other 3D gun printing enthusiasts. So that's a fascinating thing, and I wonder if kind of an alternative economy is going to emerge where if you would like to say build a hot air balloon, something that is not related to firearms, uh, you may not be able, as a non FAA certified engineer, you may not be able to go to some of the big textile companies. You might have to find a textile company at SHOT Show just because there's some of the only friendly, freedom minded, interested parties to work with. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that that's a possibility that we'll get to in the future.
Yes, so I think kind of the best example, I don't know if this is quite down the road of what you were discussing, but kind of what you mentioned a little bit before. The best example of a do it yourself community that has really been choked down is something I used to be involved in, still am a little bit, and that is model airplanes or radio control airplanes or
Yeah.
drones, if you want to use the scary term.
Deadly
About
UAV technologies.
yeah, exactly. So about a decade ago, probably, I got into doing RC airplanes, and it was back then. It was kind of there were several YouTube channels kind of getting started who were doing it. They've become very popular. It's a couple larger companies now.
Flight
But it,
Test and Peter
that's ex-
Freefall and yeah.
Flight Test was exactly who I was thinking of. They used to be small back then. They're now a huge company. It's amazing, kind of how they've grown up. But it was a fun thing. I got into it, started doing kind of long range FPV a little later. Did a lot of stuff with that. I have a large, you can't see it behind me, but I have a large kind of long duration quadcopter project I worked on a couple years
Nice.
ago. And it was a really fun, family friendly thing. Nowadays, the FAA has put forward a lot of regulations, which have been put into they've been passed and they're now in effect regulating drones, due to safety concerns, due to the risk of flying into fixed wing aircraft, which really is not an issue at all. Most of the articles you see on the subject are hype, and they're actually false. It's a party balloon or something else that later comes out. So
Yeah.
that's kind of a small example. Oh, and along the same line, the do-it-yourself drone community, which was very growing and like a very a popular thing that I was involved with back in a decade or so ago, has very much shifted over to commercial DJI equipment. And there's still that core of people who do do-it-yourself drones and model airplanes and that kind of thing, but it doesn't have the same momentum and growth behind it that I saw a decade ago. It's kind of been replaced. Just go ahead and buy a factory unit, and you're very familiar probably with the security concerns of DJI equipment, both from internationally and of course the domestic risks of the government watching exactly what you're doing. So that's kind of a niche part of what you've said there, where I'm seeing a due to risks and security concerns, which aren't really very valid, choking down on a do-it-yourself project or community.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. Obviously, I can see, and in the last few years of the Ukraine war, everybody has a pretty good idea of some of the ways that UAVs can be weaponized. But when you have guys who are building like cardboard TIE fighters for their YouTube channel, it is so far removed from that it is really interesting, the level of, I don't know, scrutiny, crackdown, but it just feels like it's not even the nanny state. It's kind of the nanny everything. It feels as if if you're having too much fun in a non-sanctioned, or if you're having too much fun in too creative a way, that's where I feel a little bit of pressure.
A good example of this, kind of along the same lines, is I believe there was a gentleman a little while back discharged fireworks from a helicopter. I don't know all the details on it, but he's a good sized YouTuber. Did this as part of a 4th of July thing, I assume last year. It's been going on for a while. And he didn't do the right permit for firing explosives on board an aircraft. And even though he did it in a safe area in the desert, I believe they've convicted him. He's going to prison for a number of years over this.
Yeah.
That's kind of an example. And it's sort of a complete lack of tolerance for anything that's not completely in the norm.
Yeah. So right now, I definitely I get the sense that there's a lot of people who are in what used to be. I mean, oh, there's so many aspects to this, because I was fascinated by the maker community 15 years ago, and a lot of the maker. Some of the main organizations, the magazines and the conventions, turned out to kind of be grifters a bit. But within those communities were tons of people who were doing the work and making cool stuff and inventing things and enjoying it as a hobby, and writing very long, complicated instructables and making YouTube videos about how they figured out this thing and solved that problem and reverse engineered this protocol, and very cool, interesting stuff. And it seems like you can still find those guys on YouTube, but they don't have tens of thousands of views anymore. They have hundreds of views. It is kind of interesting to see that kind of falling off.
That's quite interesting you brought up Instructables, because so Make Magazine is probably was one of the big popular publications of this subject, which you were probably thinking of there. They and Instructables is a website that did a lot of this do-it-yourself stuff. And Make Magazine, I used to have a subscription for. It was a pretty cool magazine, actually. There's a lot of really interesting stuff on drones. I believe they had one article had an underwater UAV. A lot of cool stuff in there. And it kind of, I almost want to say, I want to say it went woke, sort of, if that makes sense. Like they started doing a lot more not off-topic articles on social stuff rather than just the technical stuff. And then Instructables has kind of just fallen off the radar, at least for me. Like I used to do Instructables. I used to do a few of them on various stuff. And nowadays, it's not really such a big thing. So it's almost like the DIY movement, which a decade ago with, the Arduino and like do-it-yourself electronics, it's all still there nowadays, but it's no longer in the spotlight. Now, I don't know if that's just because my interests and views have shifted, or if because things really have changed there and it's no longer such a big growth, interesting thing. It's like everything, that movement consolidated itself into a few different companies and products, and then people just moved on to something else. So the stuff is still
Yeah.
there, like Send Cut Send, for an example, huge company.
They are fantastic, by the way. Yep.
Yep, yep, huge company, and they're like kind of part of that movement. Except now they just seem like another company, like it's no longer has that spark to it, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. So yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know exactly the reason behind it, but there's definitely something there.
Yeah. I think part of it is incredibly normal and encouraging. A lot of those guys who at the beginning of this were figuring stuff out, learning stuff, became good engineers or started companies and now they're doing different stuff. Like T-Rex is kind of sort of an example. There's not quite as much of that maker spirit when it comes to like making plastic holsters, but we started out. Lucas had his toaster oven and his X-Acto knives and was doing holsters one at a time by hand, and now we have Haas machines and a lot of custom built automation stuff running. So there's a lot of folks who probably just they have kind of grown up and they no longer have the time to educate people on what they're doing, and what they're doing is no longer exciting entry level stuff. So I think that there's that aspect to it as well, but there's definitely a sense that being too creative and doing stuff that's too far out of the norm with drones, with 3D printed firearms, that kind of bleeds into other 3D printed stuff, and it kind of bleeds into other remotely operated vehicles and kind of bleeds into robotics a little bit. It is a lot less cool to do that if you aren't being watched closely or associated with someone like DARPA, where it
Mm-hmm.
is properly sanctioned.
Exactly. And this kind of goes into, I guess this is a bit of a different discussion, but just weapons in general. Weapons development is very difficult because most weapon systems are already illegal. Firearms, some firearms are still a small subset of semi-automatic firearms. They have a bore smaller than 50 caliber, and are not too short and aren't too quiet, are legal. But everything else is either highly regulated or completely prohibited. In the case
Yeah.
of like any guided munitions, which makes development of weapons. And this is okay. So we're kind of changing the subject completely here. But this goes into over the last 500 years, the difference in weapons capability between large organizations, between let's say governments or the state and the people. Back in the day, it used to be pretty close, or even the people even had superior weapons to the government in some cases.
Right.
If you look at
Yeah.
like the American Revolution, better systems. They both had cannon, very easily compared. Large organizations, the state has generally historically had an advantage in certain areas like naval capability, going back a long time, several thousand years really, compared to smaller groups of people. But since about sometime in the late 1800s, I would say kind of the introduction of the machine gun, the difference, or if you want to look legally, it's maybe the 1920s. The disparity between the guns owned by the people and the weapon systems owned by the people and the weapon systems owned by the state has started to drastically separate. The state continually has more and more advanced capable systems, and the weaponry of the citizens has remained pretty much flat. And that's been done intentionally through legislation prohibiting those more advanced systems. And that's something that has not really happened before historically. It's kind of a unique position that we're in. There's probably some examples of it, but nothing nearly this extreme.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm quite concerned about because there's not really an historical example I can point to. This is a new spot we're in history where the state has a vast amount more capable weapon systems than the people. So
Yeah.
that
It's
can go.
terrible. Yeah. The examples that I can think of in history are not encouraging. Like the Celestial Empire of China had significantly disarmed the peasant class to the point where they were denied all kinds of technologies because they might be used as weapons. And the result was a huge amount of stagnation to the point that when the Europeans showed up, China, which had been developing technologies earlier than Europe had stagnated for centuries and been left completely behind in a bunch of ways. So there is there is the humanitarian side where that peasant class was extremely mistreated, but then there was also just the culture and the nation as a whole was just left behind economically and technologically and so forth. So this kind of artificial limitation that is placed on technologies because of the risks associated. Yeah, it is it has a lot of downsides to it on a lot of different areas, especially at a time when I feel like the 21st century has the potential for such incredible freedom. There are so many different technologies that are they lend themselves to decentralization. And UAVs and remotely piloted aircraft are a great example of this because you and I can't really afford large aircraft, but we can totally build small aircraft. It's a great thing for people with smaller budgets to experiment with and develop new airfoils and develop new control protocols and develop new all kinds of new types of technology with a smaller budget and really shake up stagnant monopolies. So it's a bad idea even just from an economic perspective to really clamp down on that and try to preserve the status quo. And that's just in a pure technological sense, not even talking about human rights, human dignity, or the limitations that governments should have in their jurisdictions.
Exactly. So it's definitely a problem, and it keeps experimenting with autonomous systems because, as you mentioned, with a lot of the new, if you look at some of the stuff you can do with AI, which I will place in quotation marks, with a neural network or a system that looks at patterns, you could do a lot of very advanced guidance things, which will allow munitions, for example, to be much smaller than they previously had to be. So if you want to hit a target with a traditional artillery piece, for an example, and this is kind of getting out there a little bit, but you normally have to hit it with a number of rounds to actually get the target. There's accuracy limitations, and it basically expends a lot of munitions, and munitions cost a lot of money to make. With some of the modern technology, which is being developed, probably already developed by somebody, you can get much, much more precise targeting, right down to the target, which makes the amount of munitions required much lower, which drastically reduces the cost after that guidance system has been developed. However, those types of systems are difficult or illegal to get into currently, which is making them hard to get in the civilian sector. So, just talking about them probably get you labeled as some sort of a domestic terrorist or some other type of individual.
Yeah,
So that's
I hear about amazing technologies like this, but they're very hush hush. It's the sort of thing where if Raytheon doesn't hire the guy, and Boeing doesn't hire the guy, and Lockheed Martin doesn't hire the guy, that idea doesn't get done. Even if it's a fascinatingly, uh, even if it is potentially an incredibly valuable, profitable, lucrative technology, it has to be picked up by somebody who's allowed to do it
mhm,
for it to get any kind of traction.
exactly. And that makes a lot of development difficult. Even, I mean, there's so many different examples of things weapon systems that would be very cool to work on that you can't. And of course, drones and UAVs is a big one right now in the public eye that people are familiar with. That it's surprisingly illegal to work with a lot of stuff. So that is a big obstacle right now to myself and to others who would like to develop better systems for civilian use.
Yeah, and I am curious to see what happens because there's a lot of stuff happening in Ukraine. There are home built drones, stuff that's being cobbled together with off the shelf parts. There are commercial off the shelf parts. There are industrial type drones, and there are military drones from, I would say, smaller, cheaper drone factories in countries like Turkey, for example. So you're getting to see a wide swath of drone and counter drone technologies getting used. And I know that there are companies, or rather countries, like Russia and China, who are paying very close attention to what's going on and doing rapid development based on that. And there are big think tanks in America looking at what's going on and writing books about it. And there's a lot of smart people in the United States who could help tinker and experiment and build and test. And I know people who used to develop commercial commercial drones for border patrol and various other law enforcement uses, and they just don't have the money or the permissions to do the things that they used to. Like the number of hoops to jump through to build this stuff to then try to shop around, it makes it almost a no go. Oh, and there's new tax issues that you may or may not be aware of, where R&D used to be a thing that you could write off one way, and now you have to write it off a completely different way over 10 years to a much smaller level. So
Oh,
that even that change has really
is
thrown a
is
huge
that
monkey
a
wrench
is that a
into research
new
companies.
new to this year type setup?
I
Because
believe that it's 2023 tax returns that have the new calculation. And so
interesting, because
it
I
affects T-Rex arms quite a bit because we have an R&D department and we were writing stuff off a certain way. But
same
it
here
doesn't
actually.
kill
Yeah,
us as a company. Yeah, it doesn't kill us as a company because we do a ton of stuff that is not R&D. If you were a software company and you were doing only R&D, you were doing only speculative stuff, your entire business model would have been built around this tax system. And now you find out that money that you've already spent, you're going to be taxed on in a way that you didn't plan for. That actually really hurts software companies probably more than anybody.
interesting. That's an interesting change right there. Um,
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely makes it challenging. And then one of my concerns, of course, is this new technology. While it has a great benefit um, to citizens, to kind of the freedom decentralized movement, potentially, it also can be used, and we even see it being used. This artificial intelligence and other things like this being used in the opposite way to control and observe and spy upon citizens that are living within a state.
Right. Yeah.
And it gives the state another tool to control them. And that's kind of my concern. A lot of this stuff is unless the scales are balanced a little bit, that is the direction we're currently moving in, at least in this country. A lot of
Yeah.
the drones and UAVs and such in the next decade could be used by law enforcement to do observations. To it could really go very far in a very bad direction. So that's something I'm concerned about with this technology. And unless there's kind of a civilian equivalent, the balance will be shifting even further in the direction of the state, creating a even more negative anti-freedom environment.
Yeah. The good news is I think there's a ton of people who are still experimenting and still researching in spite of the obstacles. But it is interesting the cultural shift that has happened to the point where when there is, say, an advancement in artificial intelligence, OpenAI has some new tools. Uh, Very few people, like regular individuals or small companies, are trying to figure out how can I use this to benefit myself or how can I use this to benefit my business. I see more people being like, oh, I'm going to go get investors to spin up another AI based SaaS B2B company that is just some kind of interaction with the OpenAI, with ChatGPT's API. So there is a lot of,
Distinct.
it's not just that there's not just crackdown from the government. There is a level of apathy and coasting and stagnation that I already see culturally in the tech industry in America to a big degree.
There's a distinct lack of a good application, really.
Mm-hmm.
Being applied. Yeah, a lot of like the generative AI stuff you see is pretty much worthless. A lot of it. Like the things that I would like to use AI for, like guidance systems and such, more of a vision system type area, are unfortunately, as we have mentioned, probably illegal. So that kind of
Yeah.
limits what I can do with it.
Yeah.
But there
Well,
is
on that
definitely,
note,
yep.
I was gonna change the subject completely, but go on.
Oh, no, I was going to say, yeah, I've said there's definitely a lot of potential there in that area if it can be properly applied. The challenge is a lot of the more freedom oriented people who work with firearms and such are not the same people who are really good with software, like me. So that makes it difficult finding people who have the expertise needed to work with those systems.
I was gonna say all that aside, uh, how is your hot air balloon coming? There's a lot of guidance technology you can't use. You're about to launch the least guided
So
uh, aerial vehicle that man has ever invented, I believe.
I would say that a gas balloon is probably a little bit less guided because changing your altitude in a gas balloon, you're a little bit more limited because you have limited ballast, limited amount of venting you can do, due to
Yeah.
the limited ballast. So you're kind of a little bit more long-term planning in your flights. With a hot air balloon, you can very quickly change altitude. And you can do a surprising amount of steerage. So I've been taking flight training recently because a pilot's
Okay.
license is required to fly hot air balloon, which is kind of dumb, but it's more difficult to fly than it looks, but there's actually a surprising amount of options you have by looking at the winds. So just looking outside, the winds look like they're in a pretty constant direction, but there's actually a remarkable number of layers and kind of rivers of air flowing that you can pick to fly in, and you can really within a limited window, of course, which you have to decide on before you take off, you can get to a lot of different spots that you want to get to. So it's remarkably controllable, actually.
Hmm. Is this something where you're going to look into like Doppler radar of your own so that you can guide yourself, or are you having to look at weather reports and weather radar from other sources?
I'm looking at other sources right now. I haven't really
Yeah,
considered anything other than basic weather stations as far as winds aloft. It would
yeah,
be interesting to experiment with like actual balloon based radar systems that can give you some data while you're flying. But so far, I haven't seen anything in that area. That would be an interesting area I haven't thought about.
yeah. I'm just thinking of the level of self sufficiency that you really want in a balloon. You should have your own ability, Doppler lasers or something where you're able to determine all those different air currents as you go. But that's the ultimate dream. So I mentioned that my brother Noah is interested in dirigibles and airships. I am actually fascinated by submarines. That's kind of
That's funny.
my ultimate my ultimate escape vehicle. The problem is I'm somewhat claustrophobic and I don't like the ocean very much. So it's an odd fascination for me to have. But I think submarines are just incredible, and I have designed a number of not at a very stringent technical level, kind of the same level as this firearm that is only for video game purposes in an upcoming video. That's the level that I've designed my submarines at, and
That
basic math.
that's interesting. Submarines are a fascinating subject, particularly deep sea submarines. If you look at some like bath escapes, some of the very deep sea diving submarines, they actually are very, very similar to airships in the challenges they face and in the way they function.
Yes,
Um,
yeah,
so yeah, I've looked into submarines a little bit. It would be interesting to build one for the lake, a personal submersible that you wouldn't need to register for obvious reasons.
yeah.
Though I didn't just say that. Uh,
No,
but
you would have to register it because in today's world, you are not allowed to do something that might hurt you because you are the property of the state. So making your own submarine, citizen, is the sort of thing that definitely sounds like some sort of wrong thing at this point.
so I'll ask you, if you were to build a submarine, would you use a an open submarine, so like a flooded, wet submarine with a equal pressure to the water, or would you use a pressurized submarine that maintains atmospheric pressure? Like which is your choice? So you kind of have a balance
Oh,
there between different issues and different levels of
yes.
comfort.
I'm actually pretty confident in my ability to build a wet submarine because I am dive certified and I've built waterproof stuff before, so like I think that that's very doable. But there's not as much fun in that as going full Captain Nemo. So my plan was to go full Captain Nemo and build a submarine that could go pretty deep and it could go pretty far, and you would just go places in it. So that was the dream. It's not super practical. I don't recommend that anybody listening to the podcast just go out and start doing that. But I do recommend that you go do the research, and if you get very far, call me. Now the problem is that we're in Tennessee. Tennessee has some pretty big rivers, but it's a long way to get to the ocean from here in a submarine.
And there are
So,
not a lot of
yeah,
locks in between us and the ocean, which adds a bit
yeah,
of a challenge.
it's
For
it's true. So, yeah, I'm not going to build my Captain Nemo submarine here in Tennessee. I would have to build that someplace else. But interestingly, I did a bunch of research on building it out of ferroconcrete, and that is a pretty easy. It's pretty easy to build a pressure hull out of that stuff without a lot of complicated equipment and machinery. So it's
Now,
it's an interesting
is that a
idea.
fiber filled concrete or I
It
don't
would
think
need
I've
to
heard
be
of that.
fiber filled, yeah. So concrete boats are a thing. And one of the downsides with concrete boats is they are heavy, so they can carry less cargo. But they displace, they displace a lot of water, but they still float. Now with submarines, you get a great benefit from making the submarine out of concrete, and that is you have to carry you may carry less ballast. You don't have to carry quite as much ballast. So that is a huge benefit over a steel submarine. However, there is a downside. If you need to drop the ballast quickly to get to the surface in an emergency, you don't have very much ballast to drop. So your time to figure out what's going on in an emergency and do something about it is considerably limited because so much of your hull is now essentially ballast. But concrete does have incredible compressive strength. The other cool thing about concrete is its density is similar to a lot of the ocean floor. So if you park your concrete submarine on the ocean floor, active sonar, it finds it very difficult to locate that submarine. The acoustic signature is really similar to coral reef. So in the Cold War, there were some papers written by people about building really limited concrete submarines to be ballistic submarines, and we would basically park them in strategic locations, and they would be unfindable as long as they weren't moving. So it's not an entirely original idea, but building a concrete pressure hull is a lot easier for somebody to do in their backyard than steel, and you need a lot less ballast, and it's a lot stronger in certain ways, and so it's definitely the sort of thing that people should experiment with, and don't listen to the government telling them that it's a bad idea to make submarines out of concrete.
That's interesting. It had never occurred to me, but the ballast argument is very convincing.
It's
Because
as long as nothing goes wrong, it's absolutely the way to go. There's no question.
lead is expensive.
Yeah. Lead is expensive. So I was thinking of lead and tungsten ballast with explosive bolts so that in an emergency, if you do start to take on water, you can only take on a little bit of water before you need to dump your ballast and get your giant concrete hull up to the surface pronto. So yeah, there's minor things to work out. I think hot air balloons are a much safer thing to experiment with. I think you're on a good I think you're on a good track.
Yeah, there's a lot that can go wrong with a submarine. But it's an appealing area for the obvious reasons of discretion, more so than sightseeing.
Yes.
Hot air balloons are a little bit less discreet, more into the sightseeing and big open spaces.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course, hot air balloons are only a stepping stone. The real goal is to have a large, rigid, or possibly semi-rigid airship. There's a lot of advantages to a semi-rigid over a rigid for a smaller airship. So
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff like if anyone listening to the podcast has been listening to or watching some of the drone wars stuff, a lot of the things that people have talked about with drones, the ability to look at stuff for longer periods of time than your drone batteries can last, the ability to put a radio repeater up high. There's just so much value in putting stuff up high, and there is so much energy efficiency using lifting gases to do it. It is a really fascinating thing. I'm sure you have read about Google's Loon project.
yep, super pressure balloons down in South America mostly. A really interesting project. And the most interesting part is that they had basically a variable density system, which I've got a number of patents I found that cover different ways of doing it. So basically compressing the balloon a little bit to change the amount of volume that the balloon has, and hence the lift. So and I don't know which method they used, but it was quite interesting the way they were able to do that successfully to maintain kind of the position they wanted to be in the particular airstream that they wanted to be in. So that is something I'd like to work on more. Super pressure balloons are really interesting because a ordinary balloon, like a weather balloon, it's a zero pressure balloon. So basically the gas inside the balloon is at the same pressure as the air outside. So as your balloon rises in the atmospheric pressure goes down as you get higher and higher in basically the atmospheric column, like a water column. balloon gets bigger, and critically, your lift remains the same. Because the air, it becomes less dense, which means there's less buoyancy, but your balloon's volume is going up as the gas inside expands, because it's the same amount of gas under lower pressure. So your actual net lift remains exactly the same. What that means is maintaining an even altitude with a zero pressure gas balloon is very difficult to do, because you have to precisely, perfectly trim it, and the slightest imbalance will make it either sink or rise. Super pressure balloons are fascinating because they're basically like a boat bobbing on the surface of the water, except they're bobbing in a layer of the atmosphere. They're basically their volume is fixed by a much stronger membrane than a weather balloon has. So they normally are kind of like that pumpkin shape, which I don't know. I think a geodesic design would actually be quite interesting. A geodesic tensile members on the outside, but basically it's the balloon is held into a fixed volume. It can't expand. So when it rises in the atmospheric pressure drops, the balloon expands to its working altitude, and then as it rises above that, if it overshoots its working altitude, the gas on the inside wants to expand because it now suddenly has the same pressure, because the volume is now fixed. It can't get any bigger, and the atmospheric pressure outside is continuing to drop. So the balloon tries to expand, it can't, and that's why it's called a super pressure. So the pressure inside is greater than the pressure outside, and at some point, so your volume is fixed is what's important. So as you go up in the atmosphere, it continues to get less dense, and you lose lift because you're displacing less mass of air, hence you have less lift. So it'll sink back down to that float altitude. So you can calculate an altitude in the atmosphere you want the balloon to float at. And if you have a good gas containing membrane, it can float there for several weeks or potentially even months at that steady altitude. If anyone's familiar with the scary Chinese spy balloon, that is the technology it appeared to use from the photographs I saw. Now, the problem with superpressure balloons is designing a membrane strong enough that's also light enough is difficult, and the margins of safety are very low, and the slightest miscalculation normally results in the balloon bursting. So man-carrying superpressure balloons are risky, and that's
feel
the
better
challenge.
about concrete submarines, honestly. Yeah.
So that's the whole superpressure balloon idea. It would be fascinating to have like your personal house floating at 30,000 feet for like 2 weeks while you're in your pressurized dome. But so far, it's expensive, and there's significant risk involved without better technology.
But there's huge value in smaller stuff too. As much as a flying house 21 balloon style would be the dream. Just having my own radio repeater and my own aerial observation camera floating over Hickman County for weeks or months would be pretty sweet. Like, that is so hard to do with drones, even with fixed wings. It's such a better stable camera platform. It's such a better, energy efficient radio repeater. It's high enough that we would get, huge amounts of UHF, VHF radio range. Like it's got a lot of interesting aspects to it for sure.
It does, and really like a tethered aerostat, which is currently used by you'll see them down on the border with Mexico. There's some of them. I think Israel uses a number of them. They look kind of like a one of the World War II bombardment balloons. They're probably the most practical thing. It's a tethered balloon. It's basically a kite and a balloon together. So when the wind blows, it gets lift aerodynamically, which keeps it from blowing down to the ground. So that's probably the most practical thing. However, we circle back to the issue with regulations where sending up a large kite up into the air, it would have to be a registered. I don't even know how you would do that exactly. Registered aircraft, but once again, you'll get people calling the FAA. You run into the legal regulatory problems. So
I mean, if they have paperwork for shooting explosives out of a helicopter, they have the paperwork for this. There's got to be a form that covers it. So yeah,
it's probably possible, and definitely an interesting area for radio use.
Yeah. There's even I can't even remember the there are Mylar balloons that people use as essentially passive radio repeaters, where you're just bouncing this signal off of the balloon. There's no active component. There's no antenna. There's no repeater booster.
This is a project from back in the 1960s. I forget the name of it. It was a satellite, actually. It was a passive satellite.
Passive satellites. Yeah.
You
can do that too. I
So
can't afford to put stuff into orbit right now. I'm working on it, but yeah.
so it's a similar concept, and I can't. It wasn't Project Walrus. That's a more recent project, but yeah, there were several projects for passive balloons and satellites which were abandoned because lots of funding came through for active satellites. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but yeah, they're quite
It's
interesting.
it's interesting. So sometimes when the ionosphere isn't cooperating with your HF radio plans, you just send this mylar balloon up there, highly reflective, and you just bounce your signal off of that. So there's all sorts of ways to skin the cat. And I think it's fascinating that there are we are both interact, even though we have seen Maker Magazine, Instructables. We've seen a crackdown on YouTube on certain types of 3D printed content. Even though there is a fair amount of stagnation in certain places, I think that we are both of us finding and bumping into people who are doing interesting research, doing interesting experiments, annoyed by some of the restrictions, but not put off by them. And that is really encouraging.
For sure. There's definitely a couple different people with small companies I can think of that are working on some very interesting projects. Legal projects, but very
Entirely
useful.
legal, yes.
Yeah, very useful that could bring a lot of new capability to people at low cost. Both in personal manufacturing and in the drone area. So that is definitely happening right now. It just seems to be a little bit less in the limelight. But the people doing it are very intelligent and very enthusiastic about it, which is cool to see.
Yeah. And one of the things about 3D printing that is so fascinating to me, it's not just that it's cheap and it's safe and it's very accessible, but it's moving so fast. It is a shame to me that it's not more in the limelight because the speed at which stuff is getting developed is just really fascinating. I forget his name now. There's a guy who developed a theory on printing overhangs using regular FDM printing. And he threw out the idea. And somebody wrote some code by hand that did the little concentric circles going out and out and out and out for the overhang. And about 2 months later, there was a plugin for a slicer for Cura that would actually do it. And just that level of development speed is kind of awesome. That it went from a idea to something that you could actually use in your software in months is fantastic. And it's not in the limelight, partly because the media just wants to focus on other stuff for whatever reason. But I find it really encouraging that that kind of stuff is going on. Imagine how cool it would be if it got the kind of attention where people were excited by the speed of development inside of this space. But the media has generally, we should actually somebody should do a survey. Somebody should go through Google News and see how often 3D printing is used in articles that mention firearms and how often 3D printing is mentioned in articles that don't mention firearms. Because I would actually be fascinated by that breakdown. Additive manufacturing is one of the most revolutionary things to happen to making stuff in the last few decades. And I bet you that the news media, the mainstream media, pretty much talk about it as it relates to ghost guns as much as anything else.
Yeah, usually you're going to see either ghost guns or it's going to be some not yet existent, very expensive advanced technology, which some university wrote a paper about that you see them mentioning. It's going to be one or the other. The actual kind of practical at home aspect of 3D printing, I actually really haven't seen mentioned, I don't think. So yeah, that's definitely keeping it a little bit more suppressed from the average person, but I definitely think it's catching on, especially with how low cost and how easy to use the printers are nowadays. Part of what has encouraged the rapid development and deployment of 3D printers is how it started out as a very open source, very friendly project that they didn't have, they weren't suing people. There were some controversies back then. For the most part, the software is open source. Most of the printers are open source. And that has allowed a number of companies, including companies like Creality, to make low-cost machines and really get to where we are today. And that kind of open source mindset is also what has really helped propel the 3D printed gun movement. It's very open. People are very willing to share what they're doing. And most things are released open source. So anybody can take them, modify them, use them what they like. And that kind of encourages a friendly environment for innovation, something which we're not seeing in the CAD design area, as mentioned earlier, where most of the software is at this point 50 years old, spaghetti code based on much earlier projects. It's all copyright. The companies who are doing it are dinosaur companies, kind of from a previous era, and we're not seeing nearly the level of accessibility for sure, but also new innovative features. A lot of stuff is the same way it's been for the last 20, 30 years. So that kind of open source mentality, I think, is very beneficial when it comes to anything that's not anything that involves information technology, which at this point is almost everything. Anything that involves design work or software, being open source is very beneficial.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, a number of people have said this, but in the 21st century, pretty much every company is a software company. Pretty much any project is going to have that IT component, is going to touch software at some point. So yeah, the beauty of open sourcing software is that speed of development. And Silicon Valley does this, even though there is a huge amount of possessiveness over certain things. Part of the speed that a lot of stuff has been developed between some of the giant tech companies and social media companies and things like that is just oftentimes they do share certain low-level base protocol type stuff. So when Facebook was building out a certain type of new server farm, they did open source that. Now they kept tons of Facebook stuff secret, but they open sourced some of their server farm capability because they understood that everybody in the industry could benefit from this new way of doing large scalable server rack build outs. And so even the big industries that are filled with closed source companies and people who are very possessive about stuff, you can still see the power and the advantage of the collaborative work when it happens. So of all the projects that you're doing, and we've talked about a whole bunch of random, awesome rabbit trails, things that you're researching, things that you're doing, are the 3D printed guns the most interesting thing, or is it the technology in general? Is it the aerospace exploration, building your own aircraft? Like what is sort of the main thing that all these other ideas orbit around for you?
So probably the number one interesting project that I just like spending evenings working on is actually, this is going to surprise you a lot and all the listeners. It's actually discrete computers. So computers built from transistors and relays, totally separate from everything else. Not very practical because all of this has already been done, but it is a fascinating subject. And don't want to get into it too much, but that's kind of one of the projects I really like working on, just because it's no pressure, there's no competition, it's already been done, but lots of little things you can try and lots of interesting areas with digital electronics. So that's one of the interesting projects I like to work with, but it's not really a practical one. So the guns are more of a I work with the guns because people like guns. People are interested with the guns. But more of the 3D printing and the different things that you can just make at home yourself are what I'm interested in. And weapons is a big part of it, mostly for my political ideology is very individual, freedom-based, less power to the state, and a lot of that has to do with weapon systems and a distribution of power. So that's why I've spent a lot of time focusing on different aspects of that. A good example is I'm right now kind of working on trying to figure out the best way to install and set up a closed circuit television system, which nowadays there's some interesting software available that can do AI detection and alerts and can really give you a really good picture of your surrounding area that you have cameras wired into. So that's something I don't see a lot of people talking about. And I'm 3D printing a lot of fixtures and such for that.
We just let Alexa do that for us. Did you not get the memo? We just do it in the cloud.
So yeah, and that's a big issue with a lot of security systems. So that's one of the projects I've been working on that is different, but it's equally important to having firearms and having small arms. It's a tool that will help alert you to a threat, basically. And that's one example. As we discussed a lot earlier, drones and UAVs, that's another thing which I'm interested in because it's another important weapons technology. So this kind of, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, it kind of goes into the aspect that small arms are only a small piece of the power puzzle, or only a small piece of the balance of power. If you look
Yeah.
at just look at the U.S. government and what they have in their military, and all the different tools and intelligence systems. Small arms and actually soldiers with guns is actually only a little piece of it. So there's a much bigger picture that I think people should be focusing on than simply having a gun and the gear and the night vision to run it. All the fancy little toys, because that is only really practical in a if you have what you need to support you elsewhere, or in very specific applications. There's a lot of other areas that really need focus on, and we're going to require development to be low cost and available to the average citizen.
Yeah. And I think it does really come down to the mindset. Yes, there are chilling effects from over regulation when the state is too large on certain technologies. Yes, there's a little bit of a chilling effect that comes from the media focusing on specific things. Um, but ultimately, it is what people care about and find interesting that they will work on, and it is what they care about that they will really want to continue to pursue and defend. So that is a huge part of it. And I just appreciate that you're out there experimenting and doing stuff, and that you're doing stuff in the small arms space and outside of it, because it's really easy to get focused on one thing. T-Rex Arms is a very specifically small arms company, so it's really easy for us to get sort of tunnel vision on supporting everyday carry handguns, for example. But I love that you have a wider view, and kind of are seeing things more from the 40,000 foot level, which is a perfect segue into your your hot air balloon experiment. When do you think your first
Exactly.
actual flight will be?
I'm hoping like 2 or 3 weeks, because I have to get the airworthiness
Okay.
certificate dealt with, and I have to get signed off to solo it. But yeah, so that'll be exciting. I'll post a little video when that happens. That'll be fun.
Oh, I'll be looking forward to it. So, I suppose we should wrap up the podcast, but I would love to we'll keep in touch, obviously, and then we'll be watching for future airworthiness experiments and then flights. And if anyone has anything that they want to follow you on, what's the best way for people to follow you? I know that you're on Instagram as Hoffman Tactical. Where are some of your backups for
Um,
aeronautical experiments?
Really, so aeronautical stuff. I've been trying to like grow them organically. So it's I'll mention it though. It's building balloons. If you want to find any of them, I've posted some stuff over there. So
Okay.
mainly on Instagram, but over on Twitter as well, and hopefully YouTube. Here, I'll actually upload something.
Okay.
But building balloons is a where we'll keep the lighter than air stuff.
Nice, fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the results of the experiments and the flights. But I also love all the other stuff that you're doing, and yeah, we'll keep in touch. As listeners to the podcast have any ideas or calculations on compressive strength of different hull sizes of concrete submarines or different types of non-compressible balloons, let us know, because there's a lot of stuff that we want to do with T-Rex Arms and T-Rex Labs, and there's a bunch of people out there who are experimenting with this stuff. Maker Magazine doesn't talk about you guys much anymore. YouTube doesn't recommend your stuff to me much anymore. So if you find cool stuff, send it to us organically, and we'll look forwards to more podcast interviews with people doing really cool stuff like Tim. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Isaac.